In our study of the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, we completed last time our detailed meditations on the last few verses where Sri Aurobindo declares that as commanded by the divine enjoyer, I shall only expound the bliss, removing obscurity, radiate the bliss, you who are its children. In this, we saw last time the deeper sense that to expound the bliss, to speak, is also to manifest. And we, as children of bliss also, are intended to manifest the radiance of that bliss. What does that mean in practice? This issue needs to be dealt upon in a little more detail. And although we had planned to make an overall summary of this whole text today, I thought it worth exploring this dimension first before we complete this text with a summary. So I propose to extend this by another day and look at what Sri Aurobindo has to say about it in practice and what he himself achieved and attained in his own realization. There is a long discussion on this problem in the Life Divine, spanning 2 chapters. The first of these chapters is titled Delight of Existence, the Problem. And the next chapter is titled Delight of Existence, the Solution. And the solution is, of course, a much longer chapter than the problem. And in this, he deals with the whole problem of the experience of the divine delight. On the one hand, we say that the whole world is born of bliss and formed of bliss. And yet, in our experience, we find that this bliss is not only not accessible, but the reality of our daily experience is one of pain and suffering and even of evil, none of which are in any sense an expression of the divine bliss. In the text we have studied, this question has been dealt with in a general way, in a broad stroke, by saying that what appears as not bliss, as suffering, weakness, and ignorance, is a deformation of the bliss, is a play of bliss. And throughout, the jiva, the individual soul within, is still the all-blissful enjoyer, divine, in disguise, which is enjoying only its own bliss, even while the surface personality seems to be devoid of bliss. We are also told that if we are delivered from the ego, we are delivered automatically from the ignorance and therefore also delivered from suffering, and the soul recovers its all-blissful character and becomes an enjoyer of the bliss as a being of bliss. This seems very simply stated, but what does it mean? And we need to understand the complexity of the problem. We may say even that somebody immersed in the delight of his soul is not immune to the physical pain or suffering from an injury. Or is he to be immune of that also? And if so, will it be automatic? These are all questions which Sri Aurobindo deals with in detail in this chapter called Delight of Existence, the Solution. And we may perhaps look at that in more detail next time. But in summary, he says, This is the play of the One, the Lord, the all as it reveals itself to our liberated and enlightened knowledge from the conceptive standpoint of this material universe. And this is what he elaborates in this chapter. But before we take that up, we look at a few indicative pointers to what Sri Aurobindo himself achieved and his expression of that achievement or his perception in summary. I will look at first a poem which is titled Parabrahman. It is in the collected works of the centenary volumes on page 62 and 63. And there he says, he describes the nature of this Brahman and the whole universe, the world born out of him, is a vision in the self of things, august and therefore grandly real. So in this poem, you will find very strong parallels of what he has expounded in the Upanishadic text. I skip, I'm not reading the whole thing. But the emphasis on the reality of the world, and he says, the sovereign master of his world within, he is not bound by what he does or makes. He is not bound by virtue or by sin. Awake who sleeps, and when he sleeps, awakes. And you'll find again here very strong parallels to the text we have just read of how that status of transcendence of the divine includes all that he manifests, includes all the oppositions even of what is manifested, and yet he remains always free, transcendent, while still participating and even enjoying all that he manifests. So he is not bound. He makes the laws. You remember that text also we had read. And here again he says something similar. He is not bound by waking or by sleep. He is not bound by anything at all. Laws are that he may conquer them. To creep or soar is at his will, to rise or fall. And he says, even nothingness is his conception of himself. So all that is described. He is not anything, yet all is he. He is not all, but far exceeds that scope. Both time and timelessness sink in that sea. Time is a wave and space a wandering drop. Within himself he shadowed being forth, which is a younger birth, a veil he chose to half conceal himself. Knowledge, nothing worth, save to have glimpse of its mighty cause. And his high delight, a spirit infinite, that is the fountain of this glorious world. Delight that labors in its opposite, faints in the rose, and on the rack is curled. So it describes delight as the cause, the fountain of this world, but the delight also labors in its own opposite condition. This was the triune playground that he made, and one there sports a while. He plucks his flowers, and by his bees is stung. He is dismayed, flees from himself, or has his sullen hours. So he has entered this playground, he plays in it for a while, plucks his own flower, is stung by his bees. And the last verse is the culmination of this whole discussion. The Almighty One knew labor, failure, strife. Knowledge forgot, divined itself again. He made an eager death and called it life. He stung himself with bliss and called it pain. So these last two lines you will find capture this whole problem. He made an eager death and called it life. He stung himself with bliss and called it pain. So what is this pain? Is nothing but he himself stinging himself. But since he is bliss and all his acts are an expression of bliss, it is bliss stinging bliss. But in that play, there is his choice, his freedom to call it an experience of pain. He himself is all knowledge which he chooses to forget, to conceal, and then recover, discover. And he himself creates this experience of death and loss and rebirth and calls it the play of life. So the Almighty One knew labor, failure, strife. Knowledge forgot, divined itself again. He made an eager death and called it life. He stung himself with bliss and called it pain. So this is Parabrahman. And we'll find interestingly, in this poem, over 12 verses, he has a pattern which is very similar to this text that is titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad. The whole initial portion is about his freedom and his manifestation, the reality of his manifestation, and the contraries which are all aspects of him. And the last part, limited to just 3 verses, is about his delight and the manifestation of his bliss, even in that opposite condition. So this is just for our exploration of this theme. We find also that in his own experience, Sri Aurobindo pursued this line to its culmination and to its mastery, that even in the most material consciousness, to be able to experience that divine bliss in the most extreme circumstances. The result of this is there in the text of the Life Divine, which we will see shortly. But before he could write, he had himself passed through the whole experience and its mastery. And we find this described in his record of yoga, the diary notes of his own sadhana. And I'm reading from page 47 of the new collected works of the record of yoga. And here, page 47 and 48, he discusses the initial stages of his experience. This is dated 1912, January 13th. And he says, yesterday also the discomfort of heat and cold and pain were again exiled, though not entirely. Experiments made with the body show that below a certain intensity, all pain now gives ananda of bhoga at the time of the feeling of pain. And pain beyond that degree brings it after the immediate acuteness has passed. So here's a very interesting passage showing how Sri Aurobindo was experimenting to see how far this realization of the consciousness within could be taken into the physical realization also. It is a different matter, for example, when the yogi experiences bliss within while the body suffers. You will recall the famous example of Ramana Maharshi when he was being operated upon for a cancer. He refused to have the normal injection for numbing the body, anesthetics. He refused them and simply gave his hand and asked for the surgery to be done while he was fully conscious. And while the cancer was being removed, somebody asked him, "Aren't you feeling pain? Aren't you suffering?" He was asked. And he replied in his calm poise, "There is pain, but no suffering." And we see here the double status of the surface human nature and personality, which may go through their own limited incapacities and experiences, but the inner consciousness, free, is not suffering. But the body still experiences pain. In the integral yoga, the culmination, the transformation implies that even the body should be able to experience what the self experiences. And this means, as part of the physical sadhana, even the body consciousness should be liberated from its limitations. And an aspect of that liberation is to be liberated also from the discomfort of heat, of cold, of pain, even to be liberated from the inertia of weight of the body. And all of these are described in Sri Aurobindo's record of yoga as he was working on the transformation of the body. And this text here describes something of that. That heat, cold, and pain were exiled from his experience, and these are all body experiences, though not entirely. And then he's experimenting to see how far this freedom is sustained. And he says that below a certain intensity, all pain now gives ananda of bhoga at the time of the feeling of pain. That is, if there is something sharp which hurts, there is a brief experience of pain. And at that point, the body consciousness is able to perceive it not as pain, but as ananda of bhoga. And this word bhoga, you will recall, was part of the discussion of the text that we have been reading, where he says the Sanskrit word used is bhuktam, to be enjoyed, but in the Sanskrit sense, bhoga is also to eat. It is as if the soul eats the world experience. That is, the enjoyment of the world experience is also his nourishment. And this is true only when we look at all world contact and world experience as a nourishment of the delight of world existence. And it is here that he describes, it gives ananda of bhoga, the delight of that nourishment, of that enjoyment, even at the point of feeling pain. But up to a certain intensity this works. Beyond that degree, there is the experience of pain still. But after that immediate acuteness has passed, the sharpness has gone, and then the dullness of the pain that remains, at that point again, the ananda of bhoga returns. Sometimes sahaituka rudrananda results. As I write, ahaituka tivrananda, raudrananda, and vaidyutananda, negative, are commencing. Also Vishayananda, Sahaituka and Ahaituka, begun yesterday, are becoming more definite. The bhoga of all these forms is already established. Now, all of these are different degrees and facets of the experience of the divine delight and bliss in the body consciousness through its senses. So Sahaituka is that which is caused by a certain contact. Ahaituka is causeless, it exists by itself. So he discusses Vaidyutananda, which is an aspect of an electric spreading of delight in the whole body, and Raudrananda, which is a part of an intense form of that. Tivrananda is of a still more intense form. And all these are becoming definite. And he says, the greatest difficulty is found in the prolonged contact of intense heat with a sensitive part of the body. That is, the heated stone of the floor under the midday sun. Now consider when we walk on the road or on a portion of the ground of stone particularly, which has been heated by the sun. It's not the same on different materials. On stone it is more intense because the stone absorbs and holds the heat. And when you walk on that and at midday, it can be very, very painful. And he says it is here that the greatest difficulty is found. The intensity of the heat to the sensation can be increased, lessened, or inhibited by will, capital W. That is, as he walks on that hot stone, he can choose to modify how the body senses the heat. He can choose to intensify it, lessen it, or completely neutralize it. And so he can as if walk on that stone and feel nothing, or he can feel mild warmth or an intense heat, as he chooses by his own will. The prolonged contact tends to remove the element of suffering unless the will is made to increase or maintain it, or unless the stream of will, Chit Shakti, is kept tamasic, suffering weakly the contact instead of meeting it. It's a whole technical discussion now, and you'll understand how much the inner consciousness can choose to modulate the nature of world experience. He says, this daurbalyam, weakness, has been created in order to bring about certain forms of intense ananda, chiefly viparita, that is reversed. It is possible, as is now clearly seen, to render it a great element of strong positive, not viparita, not negative, ananda. But in that case, the daurbalyam, weakness, must be merely a form of balam, strength. In other words, it must be supported by dhairyam, courage, and ananda dharana shakti, the power of containing ananda. I'm translating the Sanskrit words loosely. Ananda is now being extended to events. Even depression and sinking are met and claimed by a stream of ananda. And the place, necessity, and delight of amangalam, its true mangalamaya nature, is being impressed by the jnanam, knowledge, not only on the buddhi, but on the sanskaras of the manas, chitta, prana, and material body. So this perception of ananda and the delight of the divine perception of things is imprinted by the higher knowledge, that is the part of the divine knowledge, on the buddhi, on the intellect, and then on the habits of the sense mind, and then on the perceiving sense consciousness, and then on the life energy, and then the material body. So the first idea is that it is in the highest diviner part of knowledge, vijnanam, that this perception exists, that all is the beauty of the divine expression and divine delight. From there it is gradually impressed layer by layer through all these levels down to the most material part of the body. I'm reading out this to show you that in the actual practice of the yoga, although in one sense these things are done by the divine Shakti, we are a participant of this process and can choose to direct our awareness and direct the power of the divine Shakti to specific results. And in this way, you find layer by layer, all the gradations of consciousness are taken up and made to change their response to the world, down to the most material. So this was one example. There is another which comes in a different portion, page 38, where just a passing mention is given. Example of pure Raudrananda, of an intense Ananda, of an intense contact. Example of pure Raudrananda without discomfort from the strong bite of an ant. Now consider when an ant bites. We have different degrees of ant bites. There are those which are very small, and then there are those really vicious types. When they sting, it really gets you. And from a strong bite of an ant, there is no discomfort, but there is the experience of pure Raudrananda. And then he says, reference, experience in jail and the scorpion bite. Now these are the two experiences. One is described in his Tales of Prison Life, where he says that everything became a touch of cool, calm contact of the divine love and divine bliss. And even the ant bites were for him a touch of the divine beloved. And the other is the experience of the scorpion bite, which is also referred to in the poem we just read, where Sri Aurobindo experienced a bite of the scorpion sting, not a bite, a sting of the scorpion, and what is normally agonizingly intense pain, he felt in it the touch of the divine beloved. So he puts reference to that, and also in the context of the ant bite, and this is February of 1911. Subsequently, there are two references also to what he describes as neuralgia, which is pain in the nerves, and even there he is able to turn it into an experience of bliss. I will skip those and come to another, which is a description of a blow to the elbow. Now, we have all had at some time or other in life these blows which you get on the elbow, and there's a part there of a strong nerve that is exposed. When you get a blow to the elbow there, you can feel this intense pain like a sting spread along the line of the nerve through down to the hand and fingers, and on the other side up to the shoulder. And it can be so painful that for a while even the hand feels numb. And it is to such a blow that he refers. This is in page 609 in September of 2014. August of 2014. Strong blow on the elbow with resulting Raudrananda, continuous and varied. So there is, instead of pain, the contact of bliss, of Ananda, and it is continuous and also has variations. What to the human consciousness, ordinary human consciousness, would have been perhaps a pulsating pain, to him it is a variation of the play of bliss. And one last, which I thought worth sharing, is on page 1025. He speaks of a burning touch. Here. Both sahaituka, caused, and ahaituka, causeless, Raudrananda, are advancing. The burning touch is entirely Anandamaya. You remember the earlier problem that he faced just a few years before, when he said to walk on the bare burning stone is the biggest difficulty. There he can modify the sensation but not find in it the Ananda. And here, not transform it into Ananda. And here he is able to do that now. The burning touch is entirely Anandamaya. There's nothing left of limitation, except when it is so continued as to be intolerable. But even then, in certain forms and up to a certain degree, a high degree, it remains Anandamaya. There are signs of a similar progress, not yet so far advanced in the Marana. So, this is 1918, and by this time, of course, he had already written what is there in the record in the Life Divine, which we will now briefly explore. It is a question of how deep we want to go into this. And rather than going entirely into it, I thought we will just have a few dips of some key ideas. He quotes from the Kena Upanishad first. The name of that is the delight. As the delight, we must worship and seek after it. That is, the divine, his name is delight, Ananda. And we must worship him as Ananda and seek after him as Ananda. So now his text, In this conception of an inalienable underlying delight of existence, of which all outward or surface sensations are a positive, negative, or neutral play, waves and foamings of that infinite deep, we arrive at the true solution of the problem we are examining. And that is, the true solution is everything is this inalienable underlying delight of existence. And all the surface sensations are only positive, negative, or neutral plays, waves, foams of what is always infinitely deep delight. And it is only in this perception that we have a solution. The self of things is an infinite, indivisible existence. Of that existence, the essential nature or power is an infinite, imperishable force of self-conscious being. And of that self-consciousness, the essential nature or knowledge of itself is again an infinite, inalienable delight of being. So the essential nature is existence, of which essential nature is consciousness, of that the essential nature is inalienable, infinite delight of being. In formlessness and in all forms, in the eternal awareness of infinite and indivisible being, and in the multiform appearance of finite division, this self-existence preserves perpetually its self-delight. So even in the most extreme of finite division, which is our world experience, and at the same time in the other extreme of formlessness, in infinity, in indivisible being, it is always this self-delight. As in the apparent inconscience of matter, our soul, growing out of its bondage to its own superficial habit and particular mode of self-conscious existence, discovers that infinite conscious force, constant, immobile, brooding. So in the apparent non-sensation of matter, it comes to discover and attune itself to an infinite conscious delight, imperturbable, ecstatic, all-embracing. So when our soul grows free and we look at so-called dead matter, you take a piece of stone, what does the soul see? The mind may say, oh, this is a lump of dead matter. But that is only a phenomenal appearance. What does the soul see as the truth within? The soul sees there that there is an infinite conscious force. The whole universe is one movement of that consciousness force, remember? It's one gigantic flow of pure force. And this stone is also that infinite force, here representing itself as what? Constant, immobile, brooding. So the appearance of that inconscient stone is only the one divine force appearing in its poise of constant, immobile brooding. In the same way, in matter we find no sensation. What does the soul see? Where we see no sensation, the soul sees infinite conscious delight, imperturbable, ecstatic, all-embracing. This delight is its own delight. This self is its own self in all. But to our ordinary view of self and things which awakens and moves only upon surfaces, it remains hidden, profound, subconscious. And as it is with all forms, so it is with all experiences, whether pleasant, painful, or neutral. There too, hidden, profound, subconscious, it is that which enables and compels things to remain in existence. So although this delight of existence is there, hidden behind, because it is there, it enables everything to remain in existence, otherwise things would have collapsed. I skip a little bit and he says, delight is existence. Delight is the secret of creation. Delight is the root of birth. Delight is the cause of remaining in existence. Delight is the end of birth and that into which creation ceases. So everything we see as sheer delight. From Ananda, says the Upanishad, all existences are born. By Ananda, they remain in being and increase. To Ananda, they depart. And then he explores three aspects of the experience. First aspect is the world as Maya. The second aspect is the world as Prakriti. And the third aspect is the world as Leela, as the play of delight. And it all depends on how we look at the world. When we look at it in a certain way, the world appears to be Maya. When we look at it differently, it is Prakriti. And we look at it in a still different way, we find that it is Leela. And I'm skipping all that discussion. This triple or triune view must be the starting point for all our understanding of the universe. And then I skip again. He discusses the triple vibration of pleasure, pain, and indifference, which are the only way that we can recognize any contact of sensation. And he comes to this question of pain and the problem of the physical nature. In regard to physical pleasure and pain, it is more difficult to apply the universal truth. And the universal truth is that one can stand back and even change how things are perceived. But here, with regard to the physical pleasure and pain, it is more difficult. For this is the very domain of the nerves and the body, the center and seat of that in us whose nature is to be dominated by external contact and external pressure. Even here, however, we have glimpses of the truth. We see it in the fact that according to the habit, the same physical contact can be either pleasurable or painful. Not only to different individuals, but to the same individual under different conditions or at different stages of his development. As we see, as little children, there were points of contact which we found painful or pleasurable. As adults, they are completely different. Or even at a certain age, when we are in a state of depression, the contacts are different. When we are in a state of excitement, the same experience of the contact is very different. We see it in the fact that men in periods of great excitement or high exaltation remain physically indifferent to pain or unconscious of pain under contacts which ordinarily would inflict severe torture or suffering. In many cases, it is only when the nerves are able to reassert themselves and remind the mentality of its habitual obligation to suffer that the sense of suffering returns. We are, for example, when playing as children, we may be playing a game, we are so immersed in the game and enjoying it so much, we don't realize that our elbows have banged, our feet have got cut, and at every point we are enjoying the game. Afterwards, when the excitement subsides, it's as if the body pushes the pain and reminds the mind, here is pain, now you must suffer. And you say, oh, now I am having pain. Or people in the high of war on the battlefield, they may be even in a state of excitement, of the thrill of the battle. Afterwards, the pain comes. But this return to the habitual obligation is not inevitable. It is only habitual. Now, Sri Aurobindo is teaching us that all these responses are actually a part of the habit, even of the physical nature, and it can be modified. We see that in the phenomenon of hypnosis, not only can the hypnotized subject be successfully forbidden to feel the pain of a wound or puncture when in the abnormal state, but can be prevented with equal success from returning to his habitual reaction of suffering when he is awakened. Now, here is an extraordinary example. People demonstrate this often on stage. Somebody from the audience is called, is hypnotized, and then he is told, now you will not feel pain in this part. Let's say it is the finger. And then the hypnotist takes a needle and sticks it in, and the person does not feel anything. He takes a part of the flesh, pulls it up, and passes the needle right through, and the person feels nothing. Now, after the needle is removed, after the hypnosis passes, the person will normally feel pain. Unless the hypnotist says, after you awaken from the hypnosis, you will still not feel pain, and the wound will heal very quickly. At that point, the person comes out of hypnosis, he sees this bleeding point, he sees the damage to his tissue, but he feels no pain, even though he has come back to his normal consciousness. And how is this possible? And if this is possible by hypnosis, should it not be possible by conscious applied will on the body also? After all, the difference between hypnosis and the yogic process is that under hypnosis you subject yourself to someone else's will. In the yogic process, you subject yourself to your own higher will. And that's the difference. So it should be possible in principle, from the example that Sri Aurobindo gives us. The reason of this phenomenon is perfectly simple. It is because the hypnotizer suspends the habitual waking consciousness, which is the slave of nervous habits, and is able to appeal to the subliminal mental being in the depths, the inner mental being who is master, if he wills, of the nerves and the body. So in the deeper psychology of the integral yoga, we recognize that there is an inner mind as an inner vital and inner physical. And this subliminal mental being is in fact master, even of the nerves and the body. But if he chooses to be master, and this is the problem, normally we live in the surface mind where we are not master of our nerves and the body. If the body gets a punch on the nerves, immediately the body shrinks, the mind watches helplessly. When we go to the doctor for a normal routine checkup, the doctor takes a hammer and taps it on the elbow or the knees, and immediately the body twitches in a reflex. Our mind watches. We may try to suppress that reflex, we cannot, because the whole process of the nerves and the body has its own habit. But he says this subliminal mental being in the depths, the inner mental being, is actually master, if he wills, of the nerves and the body. And it is to that the hypnotist is appealing when he gives a command. So he says, but this freedom which is effected by hypnosis abnormally, rapidly, without true possession, by an alien will, may equally be won normally, gradually, with true possession, by one's own will, so as to effect partially or completely a victory of the mental being over the habitual nervous reactions of the body. This is something extraordinary. What the hypnotist does by this abnormal process, we should be able to do by our own will normally, but gradually and with true possession. And what would it mean? It would mean for us to be able to recover our center in the inner mind, and from there impose on the body and the nerves a different habit, different from the normal habitual nervous reactions. And in this way, even bring into the body a completely different way of being. So he says a complete victory of the mental being upon the habitual nervous reactions of the body. Now imagine when we are growing up, we are taught in our physical training or in our normal routine of school that we should be able to will ourselves, let's say, to do something we don't like to do. And that is what we call discipline. Or we should be able to, even when hungry, to wait for a while. Or when we have a craving of a desire, we should be able to postpone. Now these are basic things which we are taught, or it is imposed on us as part of the normal discipline. But nobody tells us that we can actually change how the body responds at a nervous level to these sensations of pain and pleasure or indifference. And we can actually change all that. Nobody tells us that, and so we have never even tried. But if today we began to try, to practice, to change how the body feels and responds to these things, it takes as much time to develop that skill as it takes for the other capacities or habits of the body. And the mastery of this we have seen Sri Aurobindo himself attained before he wrote these things. He continues, pain of mind and body is a device of nature, that is to say, of force in her works, meant to serve a definite transitional end in her upward evolution. The world is, from the point of view of the individual, a play, a complex shock of multitudinous forces. In the midst of this complex play, the individual stands as a limited constructed being with a limited amount of force, exposed to numberless shocks which may wound, maim, break up or disintegrate the construction which he calls himself. Pain is in the nature of a nervous and physical recoil from a dangerous or harmful contact. So this is the device nature has created of pain. She has imprinted these habits for a good reason. Because we are a small, fragile individual in this large universe, and whenever there is a contact with the world which may damage this fragile individuality, the habit that nature has imprinted in us teaches us to pull back from such a contact. And it is that which we experience as the pain. He says, it is part of what the Upanishad calls jugupsa, the shrinking of the limited being from that which is not himself and not sympathetic or in harmony with himself. Its impulse of self-defense against others. It is from this point of view an indication by nature of that which has to be avoided, or if not successfully avoided, has to be remedied. You will see with children especially, at first they are curious, they reach out, but if there is one experience of pain, instantly the body recoils, but after a while even the emotions and the mind recoil. The next time he is shown that, the child pulls back, feels the shrinking of his energies. And this is how nature protects the fragile ego formation. It does not come into being in the purely physical world so long as life does not enter into it. So the stone does not have experience of pain. It is only when you have life then there is this need for protection. For till then mechanical methods are sufficient. Its office begins when life with its frailty and imperfect possession of matter enters on the scene. It grows with the growth of mind in life. Its office continues so long as mind is bound in the life and body which it is using, dependent upon them for its knowledge and means of action, subjected to their limitations and to the egoistic impulses and aims which are born of those limitations. So as long as the mind is dependent on this ego complex of life and body for its growth and action, well, it needs this. But if and when mind in man becomes capable of being free, unegoistic, in harmony with all other beings and with the play of the universal forces, the use and office of suffering diminishes. its raison d'etre, the reason for its existence, its raison d'etre must finally cease to be, and it can only continue as an atavism of nature, a habit that has survived its use, a persistence of the lower in the as yet imperfect organization of the higher. Its eventual elimination must be an essential point in the destined conquest of the soul over subjection to matter and egoistic limitation in mind. So, for example, when we see in certain spiritually realized beings that there is still this machinery of biological pain and biological reaction, it is, he says, an indication that the higher organization is not yet perfect in the lower nature. So, especially for this yoga where all of our nature is meant to be transformed, this mastery even is an essential part. How to do this, he describes here, and I think it is worth exploring. And more important than how it is done is the principle that behind it, behind every contact, there is this principle of delight, the rasa, which is to be drawn. I would suggest that we take this in detail because it is a long paragraph, but it is central to all that we have been discussing. That in every world experience, in essence, it is the sap of delight which is there. And in the surface, superficial experience, that sap may be covered up by this pain, pleasure, or sense of, or even neutrality. It may be covered or distorted, but behind that is the sap, and it is to this sap that we enter in relation when we become free of these limited reactions. He will also give the image of the Vedic view where the world experience is seen as these outgrowths like grass or plant emerging, and the superficial form of it is cut so that deep in the roots is the sap, the essence, the rasa, which must now grow and appear in new forms. And all of that we will take up. We will discuss next time. And then only after that we will do a summary of this text. For those who would like, you can read this whole chapter where I have skipped large portions. It is the delight of existence, the solution, chapter 12 of the first part of Life Divine. We can meditate on this idea. Verse 18 and 19. For Leela indeed is the world. He has become playful for joy. Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss. Being united, play. Enjoy the bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. As commanded by the divine, I shall only expound the bliss. Removing obscurity, radiate the bliss, you who are its children.